From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Make, I think, a logical transition from James Madison's reflections on the Bill of Rights and his role in the creation of the Bill of Rights to his thoughts on religion, more broadly speaking. And the scholar who has agreed graciously to discuss this is well known to you all, James Hudson, who is the chief of the Library of Congress's Manuscript Division. Jim has been a member of the history departments of Yale and of William & Mary, and of course has written quite extensively on many dimensions of American history, not just the founding period, but a lot about the founding period. Among his recent and highly relevant publications, he was the editor of the fourth supplementary volume of Max Ferrand's Records of the Federal Convention of 1787, that classic trilogy, which has now been expanded into four. Very recently, Jim Hudson was the writer, the composer of a beautiful exhibition which resulted in a beautiful and eye-opening book on religion and the founding of the American Republic. I would like to add my personal thanks to Jim for his generous help in organizing this symposium. He has been a stalwart and has brought it all off wonderfully. Please welcome Jim Hudson.
Thank you, Charles. My paper was a bit too long, so I'll summarize the first few pages and begin with Madison's appearance in Virginia state politics, statewide politics in 1776. In the deleted section, I tried to decipher the puzzle, as Professor Banning has called it, of Madison's personal faith. I think I was able to add a few things at the margin, but had really no greater success than any other scholar in penetrating Madison's sustained silence about his religious views. Madison's privacy, I noticed, makes him a kind of tabula rasa on which scholars have created a man in the image of their own faith. Christian scholars, I'm thinking of Judge Noonan recently, have made Madison an authentic and even evangelical Christian. In the hands of those of secular inclinations like Irving Brandt, Madison becomes a deist. The mystery of Madison's religious views deprives us of the opportunity to relate private to public, to explain how his private religious life influenced his public actions. Next, I explored Madison's relations to his Baptist neighbors, especially in 1773 and 4, and concluded that the persecutions they suffered, and which by his own account he attempted to prevent, made an indelible impact on him and gave him a repugnance to any religion supported by the power of the state. On then to the summer of 1776 and to Madison's appearance as a delegate from Orange County to the Virginia Revolutionary Convention, which adopted George Mason's famous Declaration of Rights. The story has been told often and well about how the modest young Madison amended Mason's declaration, transforming the latter's grant of the fullest toleration in the exercise of religion to a guarantee that, quote, all men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience. Madison offered a corollary to his amendment, which would have effectively disestablished the Anglican Church by depriving of its ministers of all peculiar emoluments or privileges. Challenged by the Church's supporters, this initiative failed, sustaining the Anglican Church's power to tax everyone in the state for its support. Virginia's dissenting denominations had now gained equal religious rights, but remained tributaries to the old established church, an anomaly that was addressed in the first legislative session under the new Constitution, convened on October 7, 1776. Thomas Jefferson, fresh from the Continental Congress at Philadelphia, appeared at this session as a representative from Albemarle County and led a campaign which he later described as inciting the severest contests in which I have ever been engaged to bring religious liberty to Virginia in its fullest measure. Jefferson did not achieve everything he sought, but he and his allies obtained their principal goal of liberating dissenters from paying taxes to the Church of England. This exemption weighed so heavily on the remaining Anglicans that they were also relieved of paying taxes. The result was that when the Assembly adjourned on December 21, 1776, it had established a sweeping system of voluntary support of religion. Many delegates believed that the Assembly had stumbled into the wrong kind of religious equality, and that Virginia's public and spiritual interest would be better served by requiring all citizens equally to pay taxes to the church of their choice, an expedient called a general assessment. Before adjourning, the delegates resolved that the, quote, great varieties of opinion have arisen, since great varieties of opinion have arisen touching the propriety of a general assessment, that they would defer it. It would take a decade for this issue to be settled, and during that decade it became the principal religious issue in Virginia, the general assessment. During these desperate contests, those are Jefferson's words, Madison was quiet. Jefferson said his youth and modesty prevented him from venturing himself in the debate. But he had a ringside seat and absorbed all the arguments, some of which he later put to use. In 1777, there was skirmishing about a general assessment. By 1779, the tide of public opinion had turned in the direction of public support for religion. And a bill was introduced which really compromised the religious freedom guaranteed in the Declaration of Rights by prescribing an official creed that entitled subscribers to receive government tax dollars. Once again, Madison was present, but he was in the governor's council at this point, but didn't take part, obviously. The conclusion of the war with Britain in 1783 allowed the Assembly to give its undivided attention to domestic issues, one of which was still the general assessment. In the fall of 1784, its supporters came within a whisker of passing a measure in the form of Patrick Henry's bill for establishing a provision for teachers of the Christian religion. Henry's bill was more generous in spirit than the 1779 assessment bill, for it required no creedal affirmations and simply allowed each citizen to pay a modest tax to the church of his choice. This is the Henry bill, and to the church of his choice, and permitted non-church members to designate their tax for education. I'm interested in this because I think it was a provision intended as a bait for Jefferson supporters who had been vainly trying to establish a state system of public education. Henry's bill progressed to the point of being enrolled in anticipation of passage when Madison, fresh from a tour in the Continental Congress, and his allies persuaded the House of Delegates on Christmas Eve, 1784, to defer it until the next session of the Assembly. The story of how Madison and a diverse band of evangelicals and civil libertarians mounted a successful campaign in 1785 to defeat Henry's bill has been well told. And it was highlighted by Madison's celebrated Religious Liberty Manifesto, the Declaration and Remonstrance, and this is and the end result was the passage in 1786 of Jefferson's landmark statute for religious freedom. The downfall of the General Assessment Bill is usually depicted, Henry's bill, is usually depicted as a kind of slow-moving Armageddon, in which Madison and his followers, representing the forces of light and progress, gradually vanquished the legions of reaction who would have dragged America back into the dark ages of religious persecution and bigotry. There are several things wrong with this interpretation, one being that it cannot explain why, if the General Assessment Bill was so wrong-headed and regressive, it was supported by, evidence shows, most Protestants in Virginia, not to mention Virginia's most eminent patriots and champions of human liberty, including Henry, Richard Henry Lee, John Marshall, Edmund Pendleton, and George Washington. Nor can it explain why similar general assessment bills were supported after 1776 by the legislatures of 5 other states and by a galaxy of revolutionary heroes, including John Adams, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Roger Sherman, Oliver Ellsworth, and in neighboring Maryland, Samuel Chase, William Paca, and Charles Carroll. This explanatory failure is the result of a form of scholarly malpractice that Herbert Butterfield denounced early in the last century as a Whig interpretation of history. For Butterfield, Whig historians regularly succumb to the temptation of concentrating on precursors of present-day progress, and they deny their opponents, as he says, the benefit of historical understanding. Butterfield warned that Whig historians will fix their eyes on, quote, certain people who appear as special agencies of progress. In Whig eyes, Madison and his supporters deserve to be explained and extolled because they are pioneers of what is currently regarded as, quote, the progressive doctrine of strict separation of church and state. No time need be wasted on their opponents. As an offhand remark of Irving Brandt, a prime example of Butterfield's Whig historian, indicates, Brandt noted that Henry's 1784 speech advocating religious assessments, quote, had not survived, but that this was not a matter of regret, since it would have contained really nothing worth reading. Quote, a plea to unite church and state, said Brandt, is not the sort of thing on which libertarian fame is built, so you can simply disregard it, folks. Ignoring the case for general assessments does not alter the reality that after 1776, large numbers of Americans, great and small, approved them. We need to know why they did if we would fully understand Madison's opposition to the state support of religion. Advocates for assessment endorsed the distinction Virginia's Presbyterian leadership made between supporting religion as a, quote, spiritual system and in a civil way. No one wanted to turn the clock back to an era in which the state supported a system of religious beliefs because it purported to offer the one true path to salvation. What many Virginians wanted, in common with citizens in other states, was to avail themselves of what numerous petitioners to the General Assembly in the 1780s called the public utility of religion, by which they meant its capacity to promote the general welfare of society. Not only in Virginia, but in Congress and throughout the nation, religion was acclaimed repeatedly in the 1780s for its ability to promote happiness, prosperity, peace, order, security, and safety. You could paper the walls of this room with those kind of statements, as most people in the audience know. Summarizing, well, I'll get on. Religion was, how would religion do this? It was expected to come to the rescue of a kind of crumbling moral structure of society by creating a population of law-abiding good neighbors. It would, the citizens of Amherst County confidently predicted, quote, dispose men to mutual acts of benevolence and render them dutiful subjects to the state. And why was this so? It was so because religion was viewed as a uniquely effective incubator of virtue and morality. I have several statements here about religion promoting virtue, promoting morality. Most of all, it made men good citizens. I'm quoting, it created good order, good morals, and happiness, public and private. It made good men, and good men must be good citizens. According to Bishop James Madison, Madison's cousin, religion did more than that. It produced, quote, the perfection of citizens. Religion had tools that the secularists lacked, among which was the so-called system of rewards and punishments, described as bribes and terror by opponents, but effective nevertheless in guaranteeing virtuous behavior. It was a truism of the age that virtue was a prerequisite for Republican government. By producing virtue, religion enabled the state to achieve its preeminent goal, the perpetuation of republicanism. The state should concern itself with the character of its citizens was an old idea, and I trace it back at some length all the way to Plutarch. Here's a quote from Plutarch: a city, quote, a city might as well be built in the air without any earth to stand upon as a commonwealth can be constituted or preserved without the support of religion. The contest between the supporters of the general assessment and Madison was not, however, another skirmish in the battle between ancient and moderns, for Henry and his counterparts in the other states were innovators. Henceforth, states had promoted religion by, quote, exclusive establishments, by supporting one particular denomination. By proposing to give the individual citizen the option of designating his taxes to any one of a number of denominations, the advocates for general assessment had devised a new mechanism, which in the view of Leonard Levy, among others, was unique, a judgment with which Madison agreed. He said in 1884, "Experience gives no model of the general assessment." So the supporters of the general assessment packaged the measure as a panacea for the social instability in the post-war period, promising that it offered a cheap, safe, equitable means of empowering the government of Virginia to obtain the highest ends for which it had been constituted in 1776: happiness, prosperity, security, order, and the perpetuation of republicanism. Why did Madison oppose such a program? Why would anybody oppose it? It seems like too good to be true. In the first place, the scandal of the persecution of Baptists in 1773-4 seems to have produced in him a visceral aversion to the public officials employing, quote, religion as an engine of civil policy, a policy which Madison believed to be morally wrong and objectionable on practical grounds as well, for it would not, in his opinion, work as advertised. Consider in this respect three statements made by Madison in 1787. In a memorandum, The Very Well-Known Vices of the Political System, Madison speculated about the ways to prevent the injustices that seem to disfigure Republican governments. Could religion, Madison asked himself, quote, be a sufficient restraint? It is not pretended to be such on men individually considered. Will its effects be greater on them in an aggregate view? Quite the reverse. Madison repeated these views in a speech in the Federal Convention in June 6, 1787, saying little was to be expected from religion in a positive way and that it might become a motive to persecution and oppression. And he aired them for a third time in Federalist 10, of which we've heard so much this morning, November 22, 1787. In that famous essay, Madison inquired how, quote, the public good and private rights might be secured against tyrannical majorities. We well know, he answered, that neither moral nor religious motives can be relied on as an adequate control. They are not to be found such on the injustice and violence of individuals and lose their efficacy in proportion to the number combined together. These are extraordinary statements, betraying a pessimism about the social value of religion so extreme that they separate Madison from all other founders, Jefferson included. I believe they separate him from any Anglo-American statesman this side of John Stuart Mill. Mill has an essay on the utility of religion, which seems to, this is in the 1850s. I don't think you can find anybody else in the founding era denying that religion has any power to restrain violence or injustice. I'd like to be, you can correct me later, but I'd like to know who that was. I go on to say, or Madison's, are these statements mitigated by, is this harsh skepticism mitigated by subsequent statements? I can't find any. I know there's a letter to a man named Frederick Beasley in 1825 that generally addresses this. And also Madison recommends Washington's farewell address to Jefferson as a text for the University of Virginia, but there's no evidence that the passages on religion commended that valedictory to him. Okay, so in the struggle over the value of religion, Madison, he reached, not only does he find that religion had no positive social influence, he reached one other conclusion about religion, and that was the familiar one that really a Baptist view, that religion did best when it stood on its own bottom. And there are these endlessly repeated anecdotes about the Emperor Constantine. Some of you read them, that religion flourished brilliantly until Constantine made it the official religion of the Roman Empire, and that was the downfall of everything. So you need to keep religion totally divorced from the state, even assuming that it works. The principles on which Madison founded his objection to tax-supported religion, not the practical ones, have had great resonance in American history. And these principles were of course, incorporated in the Declaration of Remonstrance. The first principle was a kind of natural rights one, if you remember it, that people reserved rights when entering society. Religion was one of the reserved rights, and therefore government had no power over it. But, and therefore that document has frequently been assessed as a Lockean statement. I think what it really was, if you look at at it in whole, it was it reflected what I think another strain in British political thinking, and this was the one that emphasized threats and so forth. If you read Threats to Liberty, if you read the memorial, you'll see Madison talking about the dangers of government intervention in religion. He talks about, he says that the General Assessment Act, and it's in there, he says, could it lead to the Inquisition, the establishment of the Inquisition in Virginia. Or it might lead to a kind of an attempt to impose uniformity, as James I did, and therefore caused torrents of blood. Again, these were Baptist charges, and this whole argument was anticipated. There's an article in the Virginia Gazette, for example, in 1783, in which a writer warns that the general assessment certainly would open a door for the great red dragon, the horrible monster persecution, into our Western world. For if the legislature have a power to enforce a maintenance for the clergy, they can virtually do anything, including execute people. You even see references in the debates and the petitions to the Smithfield fires in the 1550s, in which Protestant martyrs were burned in England. All this is going to happen if you have a general assessment. Even to intimate, as Madison did in the memorial, that Henry, Lee, Marshall, Washington, and other supporters of the general assessment favored a policy that could conceivably end in auto da fes in Albemarle County appears to be the grossest form of demagoguery, an effort to frighten the citizens into opposing general assessment by circulating the crudest kinds of chimeras. Yet Madison was never called to account either by friends or enemies of the religious tax because they recognized he was employing a thoroughly respectable form of analysis clothed in impeccable revolutionary credentials. This was the argument, the opposition or country argument about the propulsiveness of power. And I have a long section here on jealousy, which was needed, so it was believed, was needed to counteract the aggressiveness of power. And jealousy was particularly potent in Virginia. I have a quote from Jefferson that free government is founded in jealousy. Madison, I would argue, played on these sentiments in the memorial. It actually commends prudent jealousy to be the first duty of citizens and one of the noblest characteristics of the Revolution. He goes on in the memorial to allude to the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, the Declaratory Act. All of these things are likely to come. The general assessment is likely to repeat this pattern if enacted. And he says, quote, "Let warning be taken at the first fruits of threatened innovation." Madison, again, this jealousy, again, he actually condemns it during the Constitutional Convention, and in the Federalist, there are several virulent, passionate denunciations of it. As for instance, he talks about the incoherent dreams of delirious jealousy that defeat any kind of rational discourse. But these admonitions he didn't apply when contemplating the prospects of government assistance to religion. Religion, in his view, was a special case, a malignant influence. Again, that term is used in the memorial, a malignant influence. A force against whose aggressive impulses and pernicious possibilities no degree of jealousy could be considered excessive. I'm skipping now all the way to over Madison's engagement at the federal level and back to Virginia to the issue of the incorporation of religious institutions, which actually arose when Madison was in the House, in the bank, the First National, the bank. At Madison, and don't worry, Charles, I'm coming to an end. Madison, as a delegate in the House, talked about the legislators. He was worried about the legislature's power to incorporate the bank. He dilated, according to House records, on the great and extensive influence that incorporated societies had on public affairs in Europe. They are a powerful machine which have always been competent to affect objects on principles in a great measure independent of the people. Madison, his jealousy aroused, actually worried that if Congress were given the power to incorporate a bank, quote, it might even establish religious teachers in every parish and pay them out of the treasury of the United States. Madison was proud of the fact that as president in 1811, he vetoed a bill to incorporate the Episcopal Church in Virginia. But then the issue of the issue of incorporating societies was really percolating in Virginia. Representatives of most denominations considered it unfair that the Assembly resolutely refused to give them the benefits of incorporations, even as it issues charters to every conceivable enterprise, including railroads, copper mining companies, mineral springs. What the churches wanted was a general incorporation law similar to those in other states that treated them equally with other organizations and treated each denomination equal with its sister confession. The efforts of Virginia's churches to obtain charters of incorporation filled Madison with foreboding. Quote, the danger of silent accumulations and encroachments by ecclesiastical bodies, he warned, have not engaged sufficient attention in the United States. Religious institutions supplicating the Assembly must, in his opinion, be watched with extraordinary violence, for charters of incorporation might be, quote, the crevices through which bigotry may introduce persecution, a monster that, feeding and thriving on its own venom, would gradually swell to a size and strength and overwhelming all laws divine and human. Are the United States, said Madison, now thoroughly worked up, quote, duly awake to the tendency of precedents they are establishing in the multiplied incorporation of religious congregations? The churches of Virginia could become as bloated with wealth as the English monasteries before their dissolution in the 16th century. Quote, how enormous were the treasures of those religious societies and how gross the corruptions engendered by them. Reverting to the lessons of the Revolution, Madison suggested the incorporation of religious societies was potentially as dangerous as the passage of the Tea Act and should be opposed on the same principle. The jealousy of Americans should never sleep. Quote, let them exert the same wisdom as in 1773 in watching every evil lurking under plausible disguises and growing up from small beginnings. By 1824, Madison had become so exercised about the danger of religious corporations that he proposed to Jefferson that the state of Virginia should consider moving against certain theologically retrograde, quote, sectarian seminaries shielded by the perpetual inviolability of charters. In 1833, 3 years before his death, he repeated this proposal, complaining about the, quote, omission of the public authorities to limit the duration of charters of religious corporations and the amount of property acquirable by them, and this might lead to an injurious accumulation of wealth. The sacred principle of separation in church and state apparently could be compromised if the wrong kind of religion or a rich kind of religion was being protected by objectionable legal vehicles. Madison is, of course, still appealed to as an oracle on church-state issues, but what is it exactly that he has to say to us? If it seems implausible that public officials, by extending modest, even-handed support to religious institutions, risk unleashing, quote, the red dragon of persecution and imposing a spiritual despotism on the country, then Madison has nothing to teach us except the folly of allowing an obsolete ideology of, quote, Argus-eyed jealousy to prevent our leaders from enlisting religion's unique resources to help rescue our fallen fellow citizens and release the nation from the grip of hydra-headed social pathologies inconceivable to the founders of this nation. If, on the other hand, we believe that the United States is not exempt from the laws of human nature, and there is no reason why the fearful religious persecutions that afflict many parts of the world today cannot cross the ocean and alight here, we should give Madison's apprehensions and his remedies the closest possible attention. In Madison's own day, good and wise men differed passionately over whether the rewards of public assistance to religion outweighed its risks. Patrick Henry and his supporters were sure that they did. Madison and his supporters were equally certain that they did not. The question is on the table again as we speak. Yes, Jack.
Jim, it's a great talk. I agree with you wholeheartedly that it's probably right to emphasize just how radical a position Madison takes. And I think it's right to suggest it's even more radical than Jefferson. You know, the very good piece
Yeah.
on this by David Curry and the Journal of Greenback, which kind of
Yeah.
positions exactly on the incorporation issue. But it seems to me your whole talk has left out one fundamental component of Madison's early and mature thinking about the religion problem, which would seem, maybe
It's in, you mean the sex, the multiple religious sects counteracting each other?
No, that's because they don't get back to
Yeah,
Lansing's point.
yeah.
No, it's a basic one that Madison says early on, and he repeats it in his old age. He says, look, we were warned back in, when we were moving towards initial establishment, we were warned back in the 1770s and 1780s, all hell would break loose. Terrible social consequences would arise, and also religion itself would be seriously enervated.
Yeah.
And what have we learned in the 30, 40 years since, in fact, Virginia has been substantially disestablished? Religion has never been in a better condition than it is now.
Right.
And that includes the dominant, the Episcopalian Church.
Yeah.
And here it seems to be the contrast with Jefferson becomes even more interesting, because where Jefferson gets, I think, terribly depressed, this is what Gordon Wood always likes to say, Jefferson gets terribly depressed by the revival of enthusiastic evangelical religion, the 18-teens, the 1820s. Madison actually takes a much more philosophical tone, saying, this is, we were right back then, but right now, religion is flourishing, the sects can still operate as mutual censors on each other, and actually we created a much better world both for civil society and for the base of civil government through a policy of radical disestablishment. Seems to me that whole dimension of his thinking, which leads to rather different conclusions from what you suggested again, is completely absent from the
No, I'm going back and actually trying to understand why, in a way, why the General Assessment Acts, why they attracted such support, and why Madison opposed them at that point. And I believe do you agree that he has that his view on the social utility of religion is practically unique?
Yeah, no,
No, I'm not.
I agree wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
Your point, but you're trying to reach a fairly dire conclusion about the social implications.
No, I was trying. Yeah.
We did it.
Yeah.
It's actually worked out for the best of all the state and society.
Well, I don't know that a lot of people would agree about that, looking at the state of current society.
No, I
Yeah.
I mean, he would look at the kinds of things that stories like
Yeah.
and say, when was American Protestantism more vital, more active, more successful, in terms of recruiting?
Right. Yeah. But
when did it contribute more
yeah. But I think the story is missing something, and it's missing the account of why these people believed in the virtues of the general assessment, which was never tried in Massachusetts. I mean, that's the path not taken, and I think it's incumbent on historians to explain why it was such an attractive option. I mean, you're of course right about Madison's. Yeah.
You stressed sort of the antipathy, I guess, between Henry and Madison regarding the General Assessment Act. But would you agree that in the legislature, Madison sort of inherited the mantle of Henry when Henry was sort of kicked upstairs to governorship, which he enjoyed, and taking over the freedom of religion?
The general interpretation of that is that Madison and his allies contrived to have Henry elevated to the chief executive so he wouldn't be able to pass the General Assessment Act. Again, I defer to others in the audience, but is that right? I mean, that's what's generally said. Yeah.
I have a couple of questions. One has to do with your references at the end of the speech, in which you make the point that either Madison has something to say to us or he doesn't, depending on certain realities.
We don't, like some of the other questions today, we don't know that. We can't possibly know what, well, maybe not, who knows?
The other thing that I would like to suggest is that when you take the position that Madison is wrong about only Madison's right that things are being solved within the country, but the fear from outside, which you attribute to Madison to the memorial. The Madison's fear that the persecutions in Europe would find their way here.
Yeah.
And you suggest that that is essentially a non-starter. Is it true?
Well, he certainly had very strong views on that.
I know that,
But whether, we don't know. I mean, they didn't.
that Madison is only valid for us if we see this horde of angry people bringing religious strife and discord from abroad. My suggestion to you, we've already got it. And I just seem to think when you talk about Joanne Bell and the Court of Oklahoma, Jehovah's Witnesses in Pennsylvania, Jim McCullough, Kim, American Deborah Wiseman, Beverly and Samuel Harris, Rachel Faulkner, from Mississippi, you're talking about homegrown persecution. And so it isn't an idle thought because it's not coming from outside. It's here.
Yeah.
It's in us.
What Madison was afraid of, though, that these groups would some other expand into kinds of invincible, monolithic powers that I think destroyed everybody else's freedom.
Question?
Yeah.
Do you think there is anything revealing about the religion of James Madison personally and his marriage to Dolly? And didn't they show a tremendous amount of hospitality in a way that was very effective politically
Well, Dolly was a Quaker, wasn't she? Said to have been anyway, and supposed to have kept a tavern. At least that's what her enemies attacked her for. She was the daughter, at least, of a tavern keeper. I don't know. My own view on Madison's religious views are, extremely. Again, I'll defer to Jack. Has anybody ever puzzled those out?
I was thinking, when you're done with your talk, we have this basic choice. We can wonder, was Madison just a very private Christian, someone?
Yeah.
Or had he really moved quietly and forcibly into the realm of deism or something like that? I have to say, by the time your talk is over, I'm much more inclined to the view that he really put Christianity behind him and he kind of split into deism and it was just being, consistent. Consistent with philosophically, he felt that religion should be a private matter and you should minimize the public discussion. But since you give us chapter, use the old biblical phrase, since you give us chapter and verse about his hostility to the established religion, it's, plausible inference is drawn from this is that he become deeply skeptical about revealed religious truth.
That's why I think he resembles Mill in many ways. If you think of Mill, that might be a nice paper topic if you think of Mill's own view on religion. Yeah. 1960, I saw in the Presbyterian Historical Review. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, your assertion that Protestants in Virginia were supportive of every general assessment.
Yeah, that comes from Daniel Dreisbach. That was a quote from Daniel Dreisbach, an article Daniel's recently written.
Is there anything to the source?
Well, he's a good historian. I didn't have time to check his evidence, but that's a direct quote from Dreisbach. It's an article.
He initially supported the federal assessment. When Washington received Madison's memorial in Boston, he wrote to someone, I don't remember who, Washington saying that he initially supported the assessment and didn't see anything wrong with it. Now he should go away because it's causing too much trouble. Like in principle, he was.
He said he didn't object to making people pay for what they professed.
Certainly the freedom of individual conscience is extraordinarily important to a lot of his thinking. The Voltaire quotes that if you have one religion, it's tyranny, two, it's civil war.
Madison was said to have been a favorite of his. The two will cut each other's throat.
We will all live at peace, and in fact, the rationale for the extended republic, for a real national government,
Yeah.
it is, first of all, private. Nobody's public, it's not in the public sphere, it's the private conscience. Everyone reads the Bible directly without the intervention
Yeah.
of a clergy. Is both very Protestant religion of a dissemination. He is a dissenter,
Yeah.
first of all.
Well, he wanted the value of the extended republic in the religious sphere was that it created numerous sects which offset each other. I mean, that's certainly Madison's vision in the religious sphere as well as in the secular one.
It is
Yeah.
angry dissenting Protestantism to say individual and not public.
Yeah.
That's consistent both with religion and atheism.
Yes, I agree. It's a very difficult topic and a real intellectual challenge, this Madison in religion. So, thanks.
Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.